Hello. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Chuck Friedman. I'm the chair of the Learning Health Sciences Department and co-chair of the Collaboratory. Very pleased to see everyone. I wanted to wish everyone a very happy holiday season as we move from one holiday onto the next this time of year. We are really thrilled with the program that we've put together for this year with the able guidance of Jody Platt and several other colleagues around ethical, legal, and social issues relating to learning health systems. And that continues today with the presentation by Kate Spector-Baghdadi, and will continue into the next calendar year. We are planning in April a very special event, which will be a symposium that is being offered in collaboration with Midas. Stay tuned for more details about that. But between now and then, there's a really, really outstanding set of presentations in store. So again, wishing you all a happy and healthy holiday. I'll turn things over to Jody Platt.
Good afternoon. Now the short people get to talk. So thank you all for being here. It's really happy to see you. I just get to sort of go over some additional logistics before introducing my colleague, Kate Spector-Baghdadi. So again, this session is going to be recorded. The link will be shared online, and there will be opportunity for short discussions throughout the presentation. So if you want a bigger table or a smaller table or a something somewhere in between, I'd encourage you to sort of move around either now or sometime during the presentation so that we should have some good discussion. So without any other sort of introduction to the session, I'll introduce Kate Spector-Baghdadi, who is a co-director at the Center for Bioethics and Social Science in Medicine and assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Michigan Medical School. She's a lawyer and bioethicist by training, and the overarching goal of her work is to improve the governance of secondary research with health data and specimens to increase the accessibility of data and generalizability of advances across diverse communities. She's the PI of a current grant from the National Human Genome Research Institute, KO1, studying how and why geneticists select data sets for their research, and the PI of a National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, R01, on hospitals sharing patient data with commercial entities. Her articles have recently been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Science, Health Affairs, and Nature Medicine, among others, and her research and expertise have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Time, and CNN. She was an associate director for President Obama's Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She's also a former board member at the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities and is current associate editor of the American Journal of Bioethics. Wow. Kate, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jody. Jody failed to mention that a lot of those articles also are with Jody, so and the R is with Jody too. So awesome. Thank you, Jody. Is my side mic working okay? Okay, one second. All right, great. So today I'd like to talk about some findings from my KO1 award that we started a couple years ago. And in particular, this KO1 award is, I'll pull up my next slide, is really supposed to focus on sort of the relationship that continues to build between academia and academic geneticists specifically and private interests and private genetic data sets. I want to take a moment to thank my team, many of whom are here. My staff, Carrie, Ryan, and JD, are awesome. So thanks to my team, my mentorship team, my colleagues, and everyone. So as you may have noticed, NIH has been putting out a lot of new policies on data sharing lately, including in the federal government. And this is just but the next step on a very long journey of data sharing that's been happening since about the 1980s, both in genetics and in the federal level, with the underlying goal and intent being that if the federal government is committing so many federal resources, federal monies into research, not only do we want to learn about the advances that that money supports, but also this increasing realization that the data that are generated are just as valuable to both validate findings that are published in the literature as well as build on them and be able to conduct different research, right? So if the government's paying for all this data, shouldn't the government have access to this data? And there's been lots of steps along this journey. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In 2003, NIH finally put out a policy that says PIs who are getting more than $500,000 need at least a timely plan to release their data. The data needs to be enough to document, support, and validate findings. And I think the other thing that's been really interesting is sort of like qualitative observations on what the government has actually cared about when they've been putting out these policies, right? So in this one, I'll highlight that the government was really concerned about principal investigators being able to benefit from the first use of their data. They really wanted to protect PIs. And then the other thing in this one is that the government, time and again over decades, keeps focusing on co-funded research with industry, which is very much a drug and development model, right, when we do industry-sponsored or industry-funded research academia. So that's where this is coming from. But that's the kind of private involvement that the government has been focused on. When private money and government money mix together to advance research, which is not what I'm focused on here. What I'm focused on is when private data sometimes mixes with academic data to support research. So in 2013, this is under the Obama administration, they sort of put out the big, so this is OSTP, which is the Office of Science and Technology and Policy, which is under the White House. So this applies to all departments and agencies under the Office of the Executive. So this is a higher level than NIH. NIH reports to OSTP. And so they're saying, hey, we're in charge of all of these departments, 20 of which spend over $100 million on research and development. And we want to make sure that these articles that government money is supporting are released within a year of publication. So this is the system we're all used to right now, where you get federal funding for your research, you have to upload things into NLM, and within a year, you have to be able to publish it. You have to be able to release it to the public. And then genetics has had its own sort of journey, starting with the Bermuda Principles. But the current policy we're working under right now is the one from 2014. And it's interesting because the genetic policy differs a little bit from our current federal policy, which is that under the genetic policy, if we have specimens, we are supposed to have gotten specific consent to use those specimens, even if they are de-identified, right? So I don't know if you guys remember the hullabaloo under the Common Rule, where the Common Rule wanted to cover all research with biospecimens, even if they were de-identified, which is sort of like its own journey that we could take, but we're not. But stemming from the Henrietta Lacks narrative and this focus on people being more concerned about their specimens than their data, well, the GDS policy is the first one that actually just put that out there with the assumption that the Common Rule was going to come along with it, but the Common Rule didn't. We still have the old system under the Common Rule. So now there's sort of this weird mismatch between the current GDS policy and the Common Rule in terms of specimens. And then this is the one that's becoming effective on January 25th, the new NIH policy. The Office of Research has been doing excellent work supporting us and guiding us to what we need to do to implement. I'm looking at Erin, I'm looking at you, you're looking at her. No, but it's great. And I've actually been sending it out to our colleagues because we were like, how are we implementing this? And I was like, well, I'll show you what Michigan's doing. And I will also say, so my birthday is actually January 25th, and that's like always when these like data sharing policies become effective. So like I'm dorky enough that I'm like, yes, for my 30th birthday, for my 40th birthday, I get a new data sharing policy. But anyway, so that's coming out. And then the 2022 OSTP memo, which I would love to talk to you guys more about in the discussion, you guys probably all know, is so now it's going to apply to any federal departments and agencies with any research and development budget. And then there's theoretically going to be no embargo for the article. Do we all know this at this point? Because this is going to be a big old change for people when this goes into effect. Because what it's likely going to do is make all journals sort of eternally open access. And all publications cost money, which theoretically can be written off if you're federally funded because you can write it into your grant. But what if you're not federally funded? And what if it's a team of federally funded researchers? Oh, what if it's a team of not federally funded researchers and they want to invite one federally funded person? Because right now the definition's really broad. If you invite someone with any federal funding onto your team, it needs to follow this rule. And how that's going to impact us, which is a really big, important conversation I think we need to have. But anyway, so that's the background of all the data sharing policies. It's really just sort of spitballing around. But sort of that movement towards a couple of overarching themes are who carries the burden of data sharing in terms of time, who pays for data sharing in terms of money, and who do they care about protecting? You know, at first, the data sharing policies were very protective of the journals, and they described them as partners that we need to spend a lot of time courting and working with. And then by the time Alondra Nelson came around in 2022, she's like, nope. She's like, they will deal with this, right? So who are we courting? Who are we concerned about? So in the scope of that background, RK from NHGRI, which is the Genetics Institute, focuses on academic geneticists and their perspectives in sharing data. So this is a piece that we put out a while ago, but this was sort of like the inspiration for the K01, which is demonstrating that academic genetic researchers are increasingly using private genetic data sets for their work, right? So this is 2011 to 2017. So it's a little dated, although we had a summer intern actually redo all this data, and the trajectories are still all the same. And you can see that bottom green square line is private industry publishing their own data. And that X blue line is total publications. But that middle triangle blue line is academics publishing with private data. So you can see that it's really academia that's pushing up the use of private genetic data in the academic literature. And one thing that's really interesting, because remember the 2022 Alondra Nelson memo says that if you have any federal funding that this policy is going to apply, is that almost 50% of these articles cited some federal funding. So we don't know what that federal funding was used for, because it's just in that big old list of thanks to our funders. But federal funding is being involved in private data research. And then also, whereas everybody's so concerned about informed consent, I feel like at this point there's just like that cut and paste paragraph they put in everything. We're really worried about participants and informed consent. Generally speaking, in these articles, people don't disclose it about half the time. It's not clear that they even know what kind of informed consent went into the data they're using. So just a quick moment for what are potential problems with having private industry control health data, right? So there are a lot of really smart articles and books about treating data as a public commons, right? So usually we think of parks, we think of fishing, we think of these sort of public goods that can either be regulated potentially, hopefully by government, or sometimes become regulated by private interests. And I use that regulated with a lower R. But what happens when industry starts to oversee our private data, it allows them sort of this gatekeeping function over what research gets enabled. Like if I have to go pretty please 23andMe, can I conduct research with your big old data set? Like, obviously, 23andMe is going to agree to research that at least is in line with their own business goals, right? Also, data usage agreements do limit your ability to share data. So all of the 23andMe data use agreements say you cannot share your data with the government, even if you're using government funding to analyze these data. And also, I think we're more used to this now, but when I started saying this like 5 or 6 years ago, it was more surprising. Like, these data purveyors change hands all the time. So just because IBM owns Watson and they say, hey, we're going to do X, Y, Z with the data, doesn't mean that that's how it's going to work for a while. And this is just from a couple months ago. I don't know who got the Optimum email, who uses that data for their research here, but University of Michigan took a very strong stance that when Optimum changed its data use agreements and it raised its prices for licensing, that Michigan is going to start backing away from use of those data sets, right? And then also, something that just happened recently is Meredith, which is just this brand new private data company, just bought all of IBM Watson's health information, which represents almost 80% of people in the US in some fashion. So this is a private company, right? Because remember, Watson was trying to make AI models. It wasn't really working that well. They were like, bail, bail. So they bailed to Meredith, who is now going to sell access to that data. I mean, that's wild, right, when we think about it? And I've been saying this for like 5 years now, and you know, I wish I didn't have to be like, oh, look, there's good examples. Like, good for me, bad for you. So this is what's happening to our data, right? And then also, I want to raise a really important equity issue, is that our data sets are horrifically non-diverse, both from the perspective of race and ethnicity, self-identified race and ethnicity, ancestry, and other kinds of demographics. People who end up in these private data sets are more likely to be wealthy and white because you have to pay somewhere along the way to have ended up in a lot of these data sets, right? You have to be able to afford clinical testing. You have to have been able to afford, 23andMe. Like, often there's a pay-to-play model in these private data sets, which makes them even less diverse. So with those things in mind, the two major questions that we were asking as part of my K was, why do academic genetic researchers choose their data sets, right? So we can see that they're increasingly choosing private data sets. Note that that is not a relative comparison. We don't know if they're increasingly choosing them in lieu of government or other data sets. We just know that they're increasingly using them. But, why are people picking data sets in the first place? If we want to encourage them to pick a certain kind of data set, a government-controlled or a more diverse data set, why are they picking them in the first place? Where do we target? And then what are their experiences? So we're going to pause in 1 second to talk about some of those questions in your groups. But just for a moment, for the methods, we interviewed 23 genetic researchers, and we sampled them by articles and by different kinds of data sets to make sure we got a diversity of people using different kinds of data sets. And then we also sent a survey to the same 2,000 genetic academic researchers. And this is an example of our demographics. You can see that it was mostly female and mostly white, but a pretty good amount of racial and ethnic diversity for this kind of study, as well as using all sorts of different kinds of genetic analysis tools and from different departments, which really goes to show you how diverse the people who are doing genetic research are in terms of academic affiliation. And we sampled people by one specific database to make sure that they talked about the private data set or the collaboratory data set or the government data set that we wanted them to. But then we asked them to compare to any data set they've ever used if they wanted to. So we actually ended up with 70 different data sets being discussed. Okay, So the first question, so this was the first paper that, thank gosh, just came out in Genetics and Medicine, which is what factors drive geneticists to select a data set. So this is going to be our first pause to talk amongst our table. And I know that you guys aren't genetic researchers by and large, but just think of when you're selecting data sets for your work, if that's part of what you do, like what are you looking for? What kinds of factors are driving you to decide between different data sets, assuming you have the choice? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Just ask, so is this genetic researchers? You ask genetic different?
Yeah, so I just...
I'm kind of pushing it back a little bit on the statement, even though I know it's peer reviewed, but my impression is that there is a huge number of researchers in biostatistics, bioinformatics, LHS, psychiatry, that are now doing research with genetic data in the UK Biobank, for example, that never would have been doing any kind of research because that's, and the UK Biobank is not private, right?
Correct, yeah.
So I feel like maybe it's a bias for looking for geneticists, because I think there's a huge number of influx of non-geneticists using genetic data that use public data.
Yeah, no, and I'm not saying that more people are using private data than people who are using government data. And actually, in the survey we just sent out, so we could look, because what we can do is we can survey PubMed, and we can search by all the major private genetic data sets, and we can see that the number's growing, but we can't see that in comparison to use of other data sets. So the survey that we just recently sent out actually asked that, and what we found is that if you're making a relative comparison, people are increasingly using government data sets and not private data sets. But we sampled this by different kinds of data sets just so we had a diversity of opinion.
Okay.
Cool?
That does make more sense.
Okay. All right, do you guys mind talking for a few minutes about what you think makes a good data set and why you would pick it? Hey guys, should we share some of our ideas? So what are things that people are looking for? Just shout it out.
Ethical data collection practices.
Whoa! And Professor Price, how would you go about finding out whether data have been collected ethically?
Oh man, I sure want to see detailed information about their informed consent procedures.
Interesting. Nicholson doesn't do any research with actual data. What else?
What's the background of the participants in the database?
Okay. Can you say more about the background? What do you mean by that?
If you are looking for certain genetic markers, are they prevalent in the database you're looking for?
Of course, yeah.
Or they make up a very, very small amount, and so you're only going to get hundreds or thousands of hits versus tens of thousands if you were to use a different one.
Right. Great. So representation of the phenotype of interest across the data set, right? Great. What else? Yeah?
So I think for a lot of genetic studies, it's the larger the data set, the better, and people are combining. And the problem tends to not be so much the ethics, but the precision of the phenotype. I think Melvin behind me, will agree. So is a self-report diagnosis of depression a valid diagnosis? Those kind of things. And for a lot of studies, I think you have that balance, that if you want a more precise and better clinical definition of the phenotype, you tend to get smaller data sets. If you want large ends, you will have to be more generous in what you accept as phenotype. That's where the balance is.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Sharon Cardia in the School of Public Health, we did a cognitive interview with her, so she helped us test our instrument. And she had the best quotes about the bigger the better that we unfortunately couldn't use. But so next time I'll know not to do a cognitive interview with Sharon because I want her quotes. Yeah, Chuck.
Maybe just putting my informatics hat on
Sure,
here.
yeah.
Presence or absence of the metadata that you would need
Yeah.
to make a decision about whether this data set is fit for your purpose in a very broad sense.
Great. And then one more?
I'm stealing Amy's.
Yeah, no, these are great. I could have done away with the K, and we could have just talked, and we could have decided. Like, I didn't really need the money. But yeah, okay. So first, I just want to emphasize that the people we interviewed were really excited about using other people's data sets, right? So as like a fundamental premise, people think this is generally a good idea. Like this interviewee, it took 2 years off of my life when I was analyzing these data because I literally had 35 different genetic-wide association study data sets, and every sample had a different clinical condition battery. Almost universally, every sample used a different microarray. That was a massive undertaking, trying to get all those individual, independent samples aligned on the same genotype reference panel. It was brutal. Or collecting data is one of the most horrific experiences known to man. That was the other potential's title. But other people's old data is really, really much better because there's more of it around. So we got lots and lots of these kinds of comments. So what we did was we asked people, hey, what are the factors you look for in a genetic data set, which is what you guys did. And then we went through from the literature and we probed by, does this matter, does this matter, does this matter? And then at the end we said, out of that entire conversation, what is the most important of those factors? So this is in response to that last question. And overall, like everyone was like access, access, access. If I don't have access to it, like all bets are off, right? I know these, it was interesting because access was also defined sort of specifically between familiarity and efficiency. And familiarity was often defined as being familiar with the people who run the data set, which, as you can imagine, vastly benefits private companies over government ones. Like, you're never going to have Joe's cell phone at UK Biobank for when, your analysis is doing funky things. But that's the kind of service, the customer service orientation that a lot of these private data sets are offering. So this is one person talking about Ambry. I know these people at Ambry, and so I know their quality, so I just go with the people I know. And then these mentors were teaching their fellows and their junior faculty these relationships, right, and introducing them. And then those junior faculty or those fellows went on to different institutions where they're like, well, I know the guy at Ambry, so let's use Ambry. And then efficiency, which interestingly was almost solely defined by a lack of having to deal with lawyers. It was like the definition of efficiency. And when people were talking about efficient data sets, not only were they talking about not having to go through legal red tape, but also some of them even said, like, we analyze the data we have. Like, there's no point in putting in a grant for data we don't have access to. So often the research project is defined by what kind of data we have access to. Database features. So interviewees were really concerned about database size, which again favored private companies. People were just really excited about the enormous size of the 23andMe data set and the value of the statistical power that entails. You guys made a lot of these points too. Several extemporaneously described their belief that government databases were already too far behind private ones to ever catch up, right? DTC companies, direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, are going to pull very far ahead of traditional NIH-funded researchers. 23andMe collaborated with us, and they contributed 600,000 subjects at the drop of a hat, whereas it had taken us 4 or 5 years to get 35,000. DTC companies are going to leapfrog over everybody, not only because they have this enormous size, but because they don't have to be getting all of these grants in order to fund their research. They don't have to pause to write it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the third thing is when we first ask people, what do you look for, what do you value, not a single person brought up demographic diversity. Not a single person talked about it. And remember, we had a pretty diverse array of researchers that we talked to. Nobody brought it up. And so it was one of our probes. So we were like, well, what about demographic diversity? Do you care about that? And so one guy was like, no. But everybody else was like, oh, yeah. No, we care about demographic diversity, but a couple of important things. So our interviewees described a world in which I'm sorry, guys. I haven't talked in public in a while. Demographic diversity just wasn't a choice. It just didn't exist in the databases that they wanted to use. They talked about the importance of homogeny, which is, accurate, certainly. And most others said, yeah, sure, we want to work with data from demographically diverse populations, but data sets are mostly made of Europeans. And this problem, if no one else is doing it, it just makes your work harder. And we're really quite limited by what other people are doing. So the problem is cyclical, right? If nobody else is doing research with diverse participants, and then I'm going to do secondary research, I can only do the secondary research on the primary populations in the first place. So it's self-affirming. And in particular, this might be true of private genetic data sets because people are affirming to become customers. And then one person was like, there's not enough people with African ancestry. So we'll just ignore them. That's not okay, right? But everybody else was like, well, it's not okay, but it's our only choice, which was interesting. And then also people were really concerned about data management features. I thought this was a particularly nice quote when we asked them about accuracy. And because you can't go into the 23andMe data set and affirm accuracy yourself, you just ask for the queries and they give you the aggregate data. And people are like, yeah, but it's really big, right? And it's self-reported. But if everybody's self-reporting in the same way, surely because of the number, they have over 12 million people. Surely because it's really, really big, that must mean it's more or less accurate. But the other interesting thing were people were talking about when they were talking about cost and data management features, they were saying, just because you have access to a data set like UK Biobank doesn't mean you can actually use it. Because often these government data sets require all this additional computational analysis and equipment to be able to effectively use the data. And people at smaller schools might not or less money might not necessarily have all that additional support structure and computational analysis function in order to be able to use these data. So this is a person saying, it's kind of a mega hassle because you end up with terabytes of data to store it, and then you need to extract what you want. We had to have all this IT support because without all these extraneous resources, all of our answers were turning out rubbish. So in terms of the findings for this paper, so we had hypothesized that people were really going to value data features, right? So they're going to be worried about size and stuff like that, data features. What we found was actually a lot of people were talking about the database features and the accessibility and the friendship and the trust that was happening there. The other thing that we found is that wanting to work with demographic, so if you're looking for diversity, right, often you have to go to smaller data sets in order to get increased diversity, right? You guys were talking about that a little bit. But then you have to put all of these different data sets together in a way that speak to each other. So people who are attempting to do research with more demographic diversity might actually end up with a higher level of analysis burden that costs more because they have to string together all of these different smaller data sets and what that should mean. And that's compounded by who's consenting and who's being recruited in the first place. And also this sort of overarching observation that without any external forces, right, in a perfect market, people are going to use the data, especially junior people, that are going to get them tenured, that are fast, they're easy to use, easy to publish, trusted data sets, that are going to go cha-ching, 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 up to 35, and then you can submit your tenure package. And without anything else compelling people to act differently, they're probably not going to. Okay, now we're going to pause for another conversation with our colleagues, because the second paper is what are experiences sharing and using shared data. So if you guys don't mind pausing and talking again for 5 or 10 minutes about, have you shared data What does that experience look like? Or have you used shared data, and what does that experience look like? All right, what do you guys think? Talk to me about sharing data. Who's shared data before? Tell me about sharing data. Super interesting. And thank you. It helps validate the generalizability of our findings for this, because this is very much what people were said to us. Sharing data was really outside the collaboratory space specifically. Sharing data was often described as this burden without any reward, right? Investigators, so this is about investigators hating to be like the main site because they're so busy collecting all the data that they don't, and sharing it, that they don't even have time to analyze it. And this is something that, a lot of these data sharing policies that the government has put out is about like who's gonna carry the weight of this burden of data sharing. But I think one of our interesting findings was that it's not just, obviously, but it's not just financial weight, right? So NIH is like, well, we'll pay for the people to clean and share your data. But the problem is that the people who clean and share data have to be pretty well educated, and facile with using this data, which means that they're probably postdocs or junior faculty. And what matters to them is not that you're paying their, $45,000 a year salary, is that they're wasting their time cleaning and sharing your data when they should be analyzing it and publishing papers in order to get a job, right? So it's that burden that people are really concerned about. Keeping our labs motivated, keeping our postdocs motivated, keeping them productive is hard enough, and then having to make them go through some really cumbersome process to make their data available, which involves both bureaucratic work and work organizing and curating, that people don't see benefit from. Like, why are we going to do that, right? And it was, how do I get a return on investment? And it was interesting, right? Because when we asked people about the benefits of using other people's data, they're like, oh, it's way better than using our own. But when we asked them about sharing data, they just saw it as something without any value. And we know this from past research, and I'm sure you guys talked about it, sort of the quantity, the quality of data, what do you have access to? And also, to your point, if people are sharing data for whatever reason, without all of the necessary phenotypic or clinical information that goes with it, is it really of any value? So even if you made your postdoc spend 6 months cleaning up the entire data set and sharing it, if you're not including all of the data that goes with it, maybe it's totally worthless to the next researcher, and you've checked the box on compliance, but you really haven't advanced the science. This guy is very easy to put a whole bunch of crap out there, right? And then this interesting intersection of private interests, right? When you're using private data sets, you're signing that DUA, and you're no longer governed by what NIH wants you to do. You're governed by that individual contract, which NIH and the feds have been allowing, they don't have to do this, but they've been allowing it to override their own best interests. But private data sets, right? So if you're publishing with private data, you're making that data more valuable, right? So when 23andMe first released its data set for research, which was like in 2010, 2012, right around there, they went on the market in 2007. People are like, this is worthless. This is self-reported clinical information. Self-reported clinical information is worthless. If it's not from a doctor, it can't possibly be accurate, right? But if people then publish with that data in JAMA, or they publish with that data, in prestigious journals, people are like, oh, well, it must be accurate because it's getting published in prestigious journals and going through peer review, and therefore the data set is worth more when these private companies go to sell it, right? And so these private companies are, in fact, getting a huge value from the federal investment in the analysis of their data. Even if people with federal funding aren't generating more data with the federal funding, which is the rule, right? So if you're not using federal funding to generate data, you don't have to share that data. But the analysis of the data is a big benefit to these private companies. And often you can't publish, and I don't know, people don't read their DUAs, that's why lawyers are great, because sometimes people go to publish their work and they find out, oh, wait, our DUA doesn't allow us to publish certain kinds of data from this. And sometimes journals are like, you can't publish without sharing your data. And 23andMe is like, well, you can't share your data. So people end up in those situations. And then, is that really necessary, all of 23andMe's protections? Probably not. It's probably because they don't want to share their most valuable asset. And this we also talked about, but this inherent tension between respecting informed consent, but also really, really wanting people to data share as much as possible. It's always stunning. We know this, but researchers are like, yeah, no, they're like rules, but like I don't know what they are, right? And so we got a lot of that. And then there is a lot of people talking about other researchers saying you can't do X, Y, Z with my data because that's not what my participants wanted. And then also this speculation like, well, maybe researchers are just saying that, when they're asking informed consent, they're saying something like, oh, you don't want us to be able to share for this kind of research or this kind of research. And maybe potentially people are actually intentionally limiting the scope of informed consent for the data sharing such that they don't have to share the data. And there's no sort of backstop for that. The government hasn't figured out how to adequately thread this needle between encouraging data sharing and also saying, oh yeah, and informed consent is really important. So a couple of things from this paper. So this idea that what people are really scared about is being scooped, right? And sharing their information and having other people publish with their data before they can, and all of the cost and burden that goes into cleaning. This is just a waste. And we know this. When people are using it, they're like, yeah, sure, there's all this data, but it doesn't necessarily have enough information for it to actually be useful for me. And then this whole focus of the government focusing on this co-funded model of industry-sponsored drug and device research and trying to apply it to data sharing in ways that make no sense, right? It just, data sharing is just an entirely different thing, and what people are doing is increasingly using private data, not necessarily increasingly using funding. And so I just said that we were just getting our data back from our survey, and what we found was of the people who said that they used federal funding to in conjunction with using a private data set, 30% of those people, so the largest proportion, said that they were using it to analyze those data and then using it towards their effort and using it towards access were other ones. So what are these loopholes that the federal government can be closing? And then, this inherent tension between maximizing data sharing while still respecting participants, which is really almost impossible to solve, but is a really good segue into what does this mean for the learning health system? You like how I did that? Did you see that, Chuck? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, please.
It's sort of an ageist question, but do you have a distribution of the age or the rank of the people that you interviewed?
Yes.
Was there a distribution of the sharing enthusiasm according to the rank?
So because it was qualitative, we didn't have enough people that we could do that kind of analysis, but we're currently analyzing our survey data, and that's exactly what we're trying to do with it, is associate different demographics like age, gender, self-identified race and ethnicity, the kind of institution you're at, with different perspectives on data sharing. So stay tuned for the next paper.
Yeah, because my experience is that the more gray hair that I spray on my head, the more enthusiastic I am to share the data because I realize I'm not going to get as much done as I thought I was going to get done
Right.
during my career. So I'm really more enthusiastic of sharing. Whereas younger, I was less enthusiastic.
No, and that was one of our main hypotheses to which we powered our survey, was that more junior people or people who are trying to use more diverse data or people who are at less well-funded institutions would have more challenges. So I don't, unfortunately, have all of that analyzed yet.
The normal logic would be, in my mind, exactly the opposite of yours. That the people, the gray-haired people I know were like, why should I share all of my data? I remember a certain person who you also know saying, I have never shared all of my in situ hybridization, etc. data. Why should I share all genetics data? Whereas the younger generation are more computational savvy
I'll let you know. JD's on it, right, JD? JD's on it. Okay, so 3 closing thoughts that we can then discuss. So one, and we know this, but the learning health system is not a closed ecosystem, right? I think it was largely envisioned at first to be something that a virtuous circle that occurs within a single institution or a single ecosystem, such that when we ask our patients and participants to consent to the learning health system, there is this idea, this ideal that they will then benefit from derived research. And that's just really not accurate anymore because of all the data sharing. So if a patient here contributes to research, it might be that a patient across the country benefits, or a patient across the country that looks nothing like them benefits. And then also, where does commercialization play into this virtuous circle, right? Because hospitals all across the country, our hospital, we're commercializing our patient data. And like, where does that fit in on that sort of like moral agreement we have with patients that they're going to benefit from the data they're sharing? And then what happens when we bring private data in? The second topic, commercialization really like undermines that central moral authority of the LHS, right? And so I love that Cass and Faden, not the Faden and Cass, but the Cass and Faden that was in the LHS symposium journal, talking about like this is the moral agreement that we make with patients, is that we're going to make them or their families or their communities' lives better. But what does that mean for when we're using industry data? And is it different than industry-sponsored research? Is using private data different than using private funding for us to conduct like drug and device research with patients? And then the last one is what, and this is a huge one, but like what is the appropriate role of emphasizing demographic diversity? We have very much swung on the pendulum a lot on this. So after the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which were largely founded on the false belief that syphilis worked differently in Black patients due to the color of their skin, and this huge history of assuming that because people looked different, it must be that their biology is different, and it must be that diseases and disorders act differently in different people. This huge history of racism that was just sort of starting to get quashed by like Dorothy Roberts and et al. And saying, no, there's no biologic difference, is sort of now rearing its head again, right? By the government and by, extraordinarily smart and well-intentioned people saying demographic diversity, including self-identified race and ethnicity, is really important. And what do we do on that spectrum? And also we know that in genetics, ancestries can sometimes affect how drugs work in different people, right? So how do we bring that all together and solve that? So that's the end of my talk. And so I'd love questions, comments, and concerns about any of this. The first one is already published, so don't give me any concerns about that. But the second one is still under review. Yeah, and any feedback on those last questions, too. Because if I solve those, then we're in good shape. Thank you. Yeah?
Contextual question. Most of your discussion was assumed United States healthcare system, commercial companies.
Yeah.
In your broader awareness of the world, as you look at countries with more consolidated national healthcare systems and more careful linkages and more control over commercial entities, to what extent do you see these issues the same everywhere, differing somewhat here? To what extent are we a special case?
Yeah, I mean, so mostly I've looked at that from the perspective of the diversity and the size of data sets. And as you know, different countries approach this very differently. And in some, they're mandated, and in some, it's not. And also, if one has a centralized health system that is continually striving to improve its care and implementing findings, that's very different than our parceled out health system in the U.S. I will say, though, that I mostly focus on the U.S. because I'm a U.S. attorney. And so most of my work is, the goal of my work is to improve policies for the US federal government under our current regulatory structure. So that's mostly where I focus. But I agree that having something like a centralized health system is a total game changer, both for collecting diverse, large data sets and also from analyzing them, right? That's why most of our researchers were also using the UK Biobank, no matter what we sampled them for.
So, if the goal of a learning health system is to, at least in part, improve care through the application of knowledge, is commercialization inconsistent with that at all? I thought part of the problem in completing the learning health cycle was actually that we just stop a publication and don't implement. And it seems like commercialization nicely clears that gap by saying, here's a giant incentive to implement the stuff that we're doing. Because it's not just publication, we want to make money. The only way we make money is if people change stuff and use the things that we've figured out. So why is commercialization like a key part of learning health system that helps overcome something that nonprofit institutions and academic medical systems struggle with?
Yeah, no, I think that that's an important question. And certainly that's been the justification for the involvement of industry in like drug and device research, right? Like the argument has always been academia cannot fully fund the kind of drug and device research needed to get new products to the market, and thus industry relationships are critical. You know, it can be part of this virtuous circle because we as academic researchers can't put a new, heart drug on the market by ourselves. And so I think it is a really interesting question about where industry can fit virtuously into the data sharing of the learning health system. And whether there's a role. I mean, certainly I'm going to turn this back to you in a second and see what you think the role is. But I don't think whatever it is, we've achieved it, because right now we're in sort of this, what do they call it in insurance when you're in like a downward spiral and you're, yes, death spiral. We're in this like death spiral, right, of where we're just investing more and more resources into private data sets that are taking over, and we're losing access to them. And like, I think Myriad's the perfect example, right? Myriad Genetics, where they had a patent on the variant associated with an increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer on the BRCA gene in Ashkenazi Jewish women, and they held that patent for decades. And then when the Supreme Court said, oh, you can't hold a patent on a naturally occurring variant in 2013, all these other companies went on the market the next day, but nobody knew how to do the test because they didn't have the reference data. Right? And I think we're seeing that writ large, where we're investing more and more resources into these private sets, and we're thinking that they're going to keep giving us crumbs. I'll actually talk to you more about that after, but let me just see if there's another question. Yeah?
So I hope I can say this clearly, because it's only 3/4
I thought you were going to say politely, and I was like, ooh, okay.
And this was really motivated by Nicholson's comment, and a thought I had when you showed that slide relating to the LHS. Your talk has been about research.
Mm-hmm.
And the LHS is about improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamental to this shift of focus from research to improvement
Mm-hmm.
is that if you're involved in improvement work, you carry an ethical obligation to do something with what you've discovered. And Nicholson is saying that if the research community has to hand off that obligation to someone else because they don't see it as part of their job, that's where industry comes in. And I hope I didn't misstate the point, Nicholson. From my vantage point, thinking about an LHS, the system, the entity is defined differently around a focus on improvement, where that boundary between discovery and implementation is removed. And the process of discovery is joined or married to the process of improvement. And there's no handoff, there's no discontinuity there. So, yeah, and if industry wants to jump on to any part of the cycle, not like there's a vacuum created at the end of the discovery process. In fact, there's a pathway, there's a smooth.
So you're saying in
transition.
LHS there's not a vacuum,
Right.
which there is in sort of research.
In sort of research, if you're thinking about who's going to carry the ball the rest of the way.
Right. But how do you think that industry can take research outcomes and translate it back to improved care? Was that what you were proposing, that you think industry can fill that vacuum?
Well, I see it more clearly in device
Right.
and drug development.
Right. Although look at poor Watson. IBM thought that they could fill that gap too, and then just sold off to the highest bidder all their data because they couldn't find what they wanted with the AI models and all the Watson data.
Right, but I would argue they structured the partnership all wrong. They said, give us the data, and we'll produce insights
Right.
From those data.
Right.
And I think the LHS is predicated on a collaborative model that IBM did not use.
Right.
And if they had, this story could have had a much happier ending.
Right. No, and I think we're in heated agreement, actually, because my argument is also that our models that we assume that, we're asking for consent and, like, we have this moral authority is because of this at least aspired virtuous circle in LHS that doesn't apply to the data sharing in the same way. And so the government is trying to regulate industry interactions with data sharing in the same way it has been doing with drugs and devices. And they're just not part of that cycle in the same way. They're just sucking. Yeah, Paige.
I think some of your other work might also speak to this, though. When we talk about the
Maybe something that you're on, Paige?
maybe not. When we talk about the moral justification of the LHS, I think it's not only about that ability to improve, it's also about an ethical commitment to patients, right? And so this commercialization piece means something to patients, right? And how do we think about the way the patients view commercialization when we're talking about the moral justification of the LHS, which is different from the sort of recruitment cycle.
Right. And we know they feel really, really badly about it. They don't want their data commercialized. But fortunately, they also don't read or understand the informed consent forms. So, did I turn off my mic first?
Exactly to that comment. So I recently had a patient read the whole consent, and this was a PhD person of color outside of the US. And she said, well, can you guarantee that my name is on no publications? I said, yes. And then she said, can you guarantee that my data will never be used commercially? I said, I don't think so. And I looked at the consent, and there's a certain part in it that says that the U of M reserves the right to commercialize. I actually went to IRB and asked if we can cross that out, and we cannot. So basically, what I'm wondering, I mean, this is an N of one, but my gut feeling is, and you just said what my gut feeling is to some extent right, that patients are not so much in favor of commercialization because they think of big pharma as being bad. And I have the feeling it's especially the diverse people that may have that reservation. So if we are not even allowed to respect the person's autonomy on a consent, if they basically are not allowed to say, no, I don't want my data to be used commercially, then do we have to change how we think about really true consent? Because that's not demanded by the Helsinki Declaration. I mean,
Right.
that's not something that has to be. That's our institution who
Yeah.
decides we want to reserve the right.
Yeah, so we don't have to gut instinct because we've done a lot of research on that, and it is entire. So I don't actually have the extra slide that's specifically the one I'm going to describe right now. But yes, the vast majority, I think it was 74% of people in one of our recent publications were uncomfortable with commercialization, and it runs along demographic lines. And time and again, so this is an analysis of our MGI data set here and differences in our patients that consented to research. We also found that there are a lot of differences in people who were approached to consent, and then there are differences in people who consented, both of which worked in the same direction of making the data set more white, older, more male, more wealthy. And so, yeah, we found that time and again. And it was, so I designed this study, this was a while ago when I was young and naive, where we were going to go in and people who had signed the MGI database and had agreed to commercialization, we're going to go back and say, hey, we know that people are uncomfortable with commercialization. What could we do with the money that would make you more comfortable? Can we invest it in the football team? Can we invest it in research? Can we invest it in your kind of research? Like, right, what would make you feel better about commercialization? And bar none, every single patient said, what are you talking about? I never would have signed an informed consent form that said that you could commercialize my data. And so, like, my poor research associate, like, went out of the room and was like, Kate, this patient's threatening to call a lawyer. And I was like, well. And so, yeah, it's true. People are really uncomfortable with commercialization. It breaks down along all sorts of demographics. And I think really the central question then becomes, so we've always sort of assumed that, hey, we know people are generally uncomfortable with even research use, even like we think we're great, but like even people are uncomfortable with the universities using their research. But we're going to do research that benefits them, and sort of the average person is like okay with it, and so like we're okay with it. But of course, our average patient is white. And then when we drill down into patients with self-identified Black, African American, Hispanic, and sometimes Asian ancestry, what we find is that our historically excluded groups are much more uncomfortable with that, right? And so then it's like this additional layer of exploitation of an already exploited population, but we want them to be in research because we want research to be generalizable, but also if we know that they're more uncomfortable than the average patient, we're exploiting them at a higher rate. So where does that leave us? And I don't actually have the solution to that. One more question, or? Okay. Somebody with the solution to that problem. Yeah. Hi. Oh, yeah. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Years ago when I was working with the Rare Disease Network, I remember the Genetic Alliance was really working with patient groups to train them to say, don't sign this consent form unless your data is shared, right? But I don't know if that kind of dynamic continues, or are there any patient or consumer groups that play a role in this that might, we also have this learning health community concept here, and I'm just wondering if you see any dynamics with like the broader consumer.
Yeah, there are a lot of different subpopulations, right? And a lot of different PIs have said, oh, we're going to pay people for use of their data, or we're going to have patients define the data sets, or we're going to have patients have direct access and what to contribute to. So there's been tons of different derivations on this theme. The problem is that they're all small. And nobody really cares about your 2,000 person data set at Harvard. And, you know, the All of Us research program, which is really the biggest one that came out under Obama in terms of trying to diversify genetic research, they have, I think it's 350,000 people right now, which is great, but it's also 350,000 people, 80% of which are from historically excluded communities, but in different ways, right? So I can't go to this data set and get 150,000 Black men with heart disease and diabetes, right? Like, everybody's different in a different way, so the problem is the size. Like, nobody's going to go to them instead of 23andMe's 12 million people, because they just don't have enough people. I mean, maybe you can use it as a reference data set to say, or an affirmative data set, or like go to, you know, All of Us and say, hey, I'm seeing something. Maybe on that can go to 23andMe and run it again. But that's the problem with this stuff.
I thought I had a solution.
No, thank you. I mean, yeah, it's a good idea. Thank you so much.
But that's why these candidates
I love it when people can't stop yelling at each other after my talks. That's like my favorite.
So as you're leaving, I just want to make a quick plug for the January session where we're going to have Dr. Osagie Obasogie, who's a lawyer and bioethicist from UC Berkeley, and it will be a really nice conversation. So happy New Year, happy holidays, and we'll see you next year.